go for 1 hour, hopefully not go beyond that. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining us today at our webinar, Decentralizing the Narrative, City Diplomacy and Taiwan's International Space, co-hosted by 9-Line and Next Generation Foundation Taiwan. My name is Juja Anna Ferenci, and I have the honor to moderate our discussion today. I'm the head of Associates Network at 9-Line and non-resident fellow at Taiwan NextGen Foundation. Today's event is the second in a series of 3 webinars on transparency, trust, Taiwan that the 2 organizations co-host in the coming months. The primary objective of this event series is to raise awareness about Taiwan among policymakers, scholars, and pundits, and to emphasize the importance of broadening and deepening Taiwan's international space within the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. The second episode, so today we will explore how sister city relations and subnational diplomacy shape Taiwan's ability to amplify its voice globally. For those of you not yet familiar with us, 9-Line is a fast-growing, entirely independent platform offering analysis on issues affecting the Indo-Pacific, seeking to connect Europe and the Indo-Pacific, stimulating nuanced dialogue through engagement with partners from all sectors. And Taiwan NextGen Foundation is a think tank and education foundation working to make Taiwan a more sustainable, diverse, and inclusive place, focusing on issues related to Taiwan's South policy and the bilingual nation 20. Today is to discuss Taiwan's role and relevance in the Indo-Pacific through the lens of city diplomacy and help shed light on the nuances often neglected in public debates. So as we recognize the long and rich history of Seattle's and Kaohsiung's sister city ties dating back to 19, we would like to use the webinar today to highlight this important relationship between the 2 port cities and discuss the geopolitical dimensions of the cooperation. So city diplomacy is not a new concept to Taiwan. Also to add that while subnational diplomacy has allowed Taiwan to build a stronger connections with overseas partners, bypass the sovereignty constraint and yield major economic benefits, Taiwan remains blocked from participating in government-to-government cooperation in innovation and global smart city projects. The extent to which city-to-city cooperation can help Taiwan strengthen ties with the international community and help decrease its isolation are some of the questions we will seek to address today. So we're pleased to welcome our speakers. I will briefly introduce you, and then we can proceed to the discussion. So I would like to start with Ms. Stacy Yellick, the International Affairs Director of the City of Seattle. Welcome. Stacy, if I may, Stacy manages the city's relationships with foreign governments and advises elected officials and department leaders on the city's international engagement efforts. This includes the sister city, coordinating activities with local stakeholders and tracking the city's participation in international networks. Then we have Ms. Evelyn Minhui Tseng, the Chief of International Affairs of the Department of Administrative and International Affairs of Kaohsiung City Government. Welcome. Prior to her current position, Evelyn has served the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and had been in Switzerland for around 4 years. She graduated from the University of Bath in UK with an MA in Interpreting and Translation. And so foreign languages and international affairs have always been her true passion. Then next we have Dr. Jeff Ho. Jeff is faculty member of the University of Washington, Seattle, Taiwan Studies Program, professor of landscape architecture, and director of the Urban Commons Lab. Also, thanks for joining us. Professor Ho's research, teaching, and practice focus on community design, design activism, public space and democracy, and social and environmental justice. In a career that spans across the Pacific, Dr. Ho has worked with indigenous tribes, farmers and fishers in Taiwan, neighborhood residents in Japan, in China, and city immigrant youth and elders in North American cities, in projects ranging from conservation of wildlife habitats to design of urban open space. And last but not least, we have Dr. Sarah Nolan. Thanks for joining us. Sarah is assistant professor of government at Smith College and a specialist on local governance in mainland China and Taiwan. Sarah's interest in local governance has shaped a new set of projects on the role of subnational governments in international relations, with a focus on ties between US cities and states and their counterparts in mainland China and Taiwan. So welcome all of you, and I look forward to moderating the exchange. And finally, before we proceed, I need to make just one quick announcement that we're taking questions from the audience. So I invite all of you joining us today to start sending in your questions already as soon as you have them. So feel free to start sending them in either by using the hashtag TaiwanWeb21 or by dropping them in our live stream on Facebook or YouTube pages. And so without further ado, I would suggest that we start. So what we will do in the first half of the exchange, I thought we would have a quick round of your initial remarks that you would like to contribute with to the conversation. And then we'll have a quick, I hope, kind of also constructive exchange. And so I'll try to be strict with time so that we make sure that we get as much out of this as we can. So I apologize in advance if I push you a little bit on time, but I think it will be to the benefit of all of us. So let's start with Stacy, if I may. The question I had for you, the question I had in mind is, so in your capacity as the International Affairs Director of the City of Seattle, can you just say a few words on the Seattle-Kaohsiung Sister City Cooperation and also the relevance of this cooperation to addressing the challenges Taiwan is currently facing in the Indo-Pacific? So 3-4 minutes, if you could please.
Sure, thank you. So Seattle and Kaohsiung have been sister cities, as you mentioned, since 1991 for 30 years. And so that relationship, as many of our sister city relationships it's really run by a group of local volunteers who have long wanted to have some kind of connection with the city of Kaohsiung or with Taiwan generally. And the city of Seattle, we have a very, very small, limited capacity to manage those relationships. So we really work with a local community of partners that is interested and passionate about maintaining these partnerships. And so all of our sister cities have sister city associations. And so that sister city association works closely with my office and then also with the city of Kaohsiung to initiate programs and think of new ideas and partnerships. Now, the Sister City program was built precisely to promote people-to-people diplomacy, precisely so that when government issues are challenging, people-to-people relationships can still be maintained and can still flourish. And so that's really important for us to know that we have a strong local community that wants to pursue those people-to-people partnerships. Now, going forward, what we're finding is that those city partnerships aren't just, I should say, local partnerships aren't viewed as just people-to-people places for people-to-people programs to happen, but now they're being viewed as places where city-to-city programs happen. And I think there's a distinction now between the people-to-people components and some of the city-to-city government components. And so I think we're really able to build on those people-to-people relationships that have existed in the past to really talk more deliberately about how our cities can partner together on some of the challenges that our local governments are facing. And so that's kind of exciting and opening up new doors for thinking about how we can partner on larger issues of climate change, equity, and so many other issues in the sister city space. So it's really expanding our ability to work together on a broader range of topics. So we're looking forward in the city of Seattle on doing that with Kaohsiung and all of our sister cities to really see where that can lead us and grow our partnership in the future.
Thank you. And thanks for pointing out the layers of people to people and city to city and the broader context. And also thanks for sticking to your time. So let's move on to Evelyn, if I may. So I'd like to ask you the exact same question, but from your perspective in Kaohsiung. How do you see this bilateral cooperation, and how do you see this in the broader international context in tackling the challenges and also addressing common challenges, but also Taiwan's own challenges in the international space?
Thank you. In Kaohsiung, we really value as well our relationship with Seattle, and we are very happy to continue to manage this relationship. And recent years, our main exchanges are in the areas of, for example, sports, education, and also city development. And we are really looking forward to further this relationship. And here in Kaohsiung, we are promoting city diplomacy in 3 ways, including sister cities, which of course are very important to us and we hold close to our hearts. But we also value our relationship with other international cities as well. And also because most of the diplomatic corps in Taiwan are located in Taipei. So we are working also very hard to attract them to travel to the south of Taiwan, to our city, to understand more of this vibrant harbor cities. So I would say that for Kaohsiung City government, we value the sister cities relationship, and we try to attract our bureaus to utilize their different areas of expertise so they can work with our sister cities and we can develop some actual projects to have some actual results, so that sister city is not just a term or it's just a number or a rising number. It's something that is deeply rooted and it could blossom to something else. And to expand the city diplomacy of Kaohsiung, we also work hard on establishing new relationships with other international cities and also diplomatic corps here in Taiwan. This is what I would like to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very brief and strong and solid. So I think it's very useful in the next half an hour if you will then elaborate on more concretely on the, like you mentioned, the sports and education. So I think we will have time to go into further details. So then I would like to now turn to Jeff, if I may. So the question I had for you is, given your background in landscape architecture, planning, and public art, but also your research on citizens' agency when it comes to cities and democracy and your work with indigenous tribes, how do you see subnational diplomacy as a tool to support the voice of Taiwan internationally? And what are your first initial thoughts that you would like to share with us?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me on this panel. So as Dr. Ferenczi has mentioned, I'm a professor of a big focus of my research and teaching at university is on urbanism, including urbanism in Asia. So we study issues faced by contemporary cities in the region. We organize networks of colleagues around the world to facilitate collaborations, including collaboration in research. We bring students to visit different cities through Studies Abroad program. I have a program that brings students to Taiwan every other year. So that's sort of a form of kind of subnational diplomacy, if you will. Cities have historically been gateways to a lot of things, global trade and commerce, centers of innovations and creativity. Increasingly, we're also seeing cities trying to learn from each other. They face similar challenges of planning, governance, development, and so forth. And so I would say that the pandemic is actually a perfect example. City issues such as how to better manage open space, public transport to address the public health crises. And cities in Taiwan, especially Kaohsiung, I think has a lot to offer in this respect. Kaohsiung's success in controlling the outbreaks of COVID-19 has been suggested as a sort of a textbook example. And the urban renaissance and the transformation in the cityscape from a heavily polluted city to one with vibrant cultural life, I think is something that a lot of cities would like to emulate. And so as an academic, I think one thing I will also like to add to this conversation is how can we better leverage the educational and research institutions in the respective cities for this kind of subnational city diplomacy. And in Kaohsiung, for example, there are top universities in Taiwan that are well connected to their colleagues around the world. So cities and universities can work together to promote city diplomacy. We'd be happy to talk more about that later on.
Thank you. I'm really glad you also mentioned the pandemic and also the challenges that the pandemic has brought to governance, and also that this can be an opportunity for cities to become more fair and just and sustainable, and the role of universities. So thank you for your contribution. And then now I would like to turn on to you, Sarah, and maybe you can already, if you feel free or comfortable to already comment on Jeff's research, because I think your work also connects to a great extent in terms of city diplomacy and connecting that with Taiwan. So what is your research and your first initial thoughts you would like to share?
Sure. It was interesting to me to hear the comments that Stacy and Evelyn were making, because you are exactly the kind of folks that I have been studying in some of my research. And I think what you're describing is maybe a somewhat rosier picture of city level diplomacy than I think some cities would present. And so one of the things that has come up in my research is some of the challenges to using city level diplomacy as a tool for kind of increasing Taiwan's international space. And I think one of the challenges relates to something that Stacy was talking about, which is that a lot of these efforts really rely on enthusiasm from local citizens and also on funding that local governments aren't necessarily in a position to provide. And so Taiwan has quite a lot of sister city agreements with US cities, but many of them are basically inactive. There isn't very much connection either between officials in the different cities or in terms of kind of person-to-person diplomacy. And so those seem like a lost opportunity for Taiwan to build stronger ties to cities in the US and elsewhere. I think when people get a chance to visit Taiwan, they really like it. And so those kind of person-to-person efforts or contact between officials can be really beneficial for Taiwan in terms of building its soft power. But if those relationships are kind of dormant, they're not as effective as they could be. And then I think the second challenge that has become serious in some cities is pressure from the PRC on cities that sign sister city agreements with cities in Taiwan. So the kind of most famous example of this in the last couple of years was the sister city agreement between Taipei and Prague. After that agreement was signed, then Shanghai announced that it was going to sever its sister city relationship with Prague in retaliation. And that's not the only example of that kind of tit for tat situation or situations in which PRC cities, when they sign a sister city agreement with a US city, try to sort of embed a promise to follow the PRC version of the one China principle, and then sort of use that as evidence that those cities then cannot sign a sister city agreement with Taiwan in the future. There's nothing in US policy that prevents an American city from signing an agreement with a city in Taiwan. The US's version of the one China policy does not preclude that kind of subnational diplomacy, but I think sometimes city level officials, especially perhaps in smaller cities that don't have someone like Stacy who's an expert in international affairs, they can be sort of bullied into thinking that they're doing something wrong by engaging with Taiwan.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And thanks also for making that switch to the geopolitics of city diplomacy, right? And the challenges and ways that we can maybe reflect on how we can actually use subnational diplomacy through cities to circumvent the kind of isolation that Taiwan faces. So what I would suggest, if you're okay with that, is I'm happy to allow you to maybe already comment on each other's points. Maybe new ideas came to you without me specifically asking further questions. So maybe we can start with that, and I'm happy to moderate. So if anyone has already anything to add or ask each other in terms of because I think there's a lot of content, as Evelyn, you mentioned the specific cooperation between the two cities in terms of sports. I think that's also interesting to see where we stand and where we can build on those and where we can strengthen. Because I think it's one thing to recognize where we are and what we can strengthen and what we can build on that. So the floor is open. Anyone would like to go first?
Sure, I'd like to go first, actually.
Thank you.
And respond to Sarah in a way. I think Sarah reminded us something that is quite important, that these kind of official ties between sister cities in particular do face a lot of constraints. I mean, US cities are really constrained by their municipal budgets. And Taiwan City, on the other hand, especially large cities like Kaohsiung and Taipei, in some way much better funded. And but I would argue that city diplomacy actually encompasses more than just these kind of official ties. They are official ties between, as I mentioned, research institutions, NGOs, various civic organizations, and exchanges of students, for example, as a form of kind of diplomacy, I would argue. So I think it's important to recognize the constraints at the official level, but there's a lot of other things that can be done to promote city diplomacy.
And I think we really operate that way here in Seattle. It's not the city always leading the relationship. It's the city working with the University of Washington, working with the Sister City Association, working with our regional economic development agency when they're doing business exchanges. And so you're working with our Port of Seattle because they have some port and business ties with different sister cities. So it's really bringing all of these partner organizations together to figure out who's working on something in Taiwan right now, or who's working on something with Kaohsiung right now. And you're not, it's definitely not the city leading. To your point, Sarah, that we do rely on those volunteers and the passion of those volunteers, and that it is a good thing, because it means that when there is enthusiasm and passion, those relationships are especially robust and strong, and they can do a lot of fundraising. But the downside is definitely that the city isn't the leader of that effort in the same way that it is, at least here in Seattle. Other US cities and other global cities may be different, but the city government isn't always leading that. We're kind of trying to work with other partners to advance something. Has its upsides and downsides for certain.
If I may respond, I would like to respond to Susa and Stacy, and also for Sarah's comment earlier. First, I would like to share with you the sports exchanges that you have mentioned earlier. Actually, the Seattle delegation had come to Kaohsiung and joined us in the Dragon Boat Festival at least twice lately. And I remember at one year, it's a senator leading a delegation, and they have joined with our local firefighters in a team to race against our city government officials. So I think you can imagine who won that race. And I think it's a very good example of how by sports and by visiting each other that we can really sit down face to face and talk about how we can elaborate our cooperation in the future. And then I would like to respond to Stacy, because you mentioned about how in Seattle you are relying more on the civil groups for their work to promote the sister city relationships. But here in Kaohsiung, and I think most of the cities in Taiwan, it's different because mostly the sister city relationship is managed by the city government. So for example, here in Kaohsiung, we are planning what to do with the sister cities, and we try to set aside different budgets for specific sister cities and what areas we're going to promote. So mostly here in Kaohsiung, it's the civil servants, me and my staff in the office, that we're doing this job together. And lastly, I would like to respond to Sarah's comment earlier. It's very interesting how you just directly point out the not so rosy picture of the city diplomacy. And I think from my observation, a lot of the international cities, they are actually now not trying to sign new sister cities because it's really not that easy to manage, and you need a lot of the people and time and also budget to put into it. And you have mentioned about also the dormant sister cities that a lot of Taiwanese city has signed with the US. And at least from Kaohsiung's side, a lot of those American sister cities are signed around 1970s. So it's actually a very difficult time when Taiwan and US are facing a huge change of formal diplomatic relation. So that's the background of that time, that we are changing from the central government agreements to local governments. And I think because a more ideal sister city relationship will be building on what we have in common or what we have that's complementary. So now what we're trying to do is to establish some solid exchanges first to identify the areas that we can work on, and then move on to signing sister city agreement instead of just, hey, good to meet you, and let's sign a sister city agreement. So this is something that we are trying to working on here in Kaohsiung. Thank you.
Thanks, Evelyn. I think the way you said earlier that what we can do to make sure that sister city is not just a term, but it's deeply rooted. I think one way to look at, I always wonder to what extent sister city partnerships and such subnational diplomacy actually, how do you measure the effectiveness of it in terms of raising awareness of Taiwan in the United States or in Europe? Because as you know, there's also, from a European perspective, we have sister city partnerships, and there's always the challenge of them going dormant and what the content is. So in your expert views, I think it would be interesting to hear your comments on the effectiveness of sister cities in raising awareness among the public, because I think that's a very important element when we speak about Taiwan internationally. And how do you measure that effectiveness? So I don't know if anyone wants to take that question.
If I may respond, I think a lot of the times we are facing similar challenges. I think Stacy as well are trying to promote sister cities, but many of the citizens, they really don't know what sister cities we have and what we are doing. there's a distance between the sister cities and our citizens. So, for example, now under the challenge of the COVID pandemic, we are promoting some small-scale exhibition. It's not a huge project, but I would like to share with you. For example, last year we are making portable and foldable exhibition stands, and we mail them to our sister cities abroad so they can display them at public spaces, for example, in subway stations or city halls, so that without traveling, our friends in the sister cities abroad, they can still have some contact with, oh, we have a sister city called Kaohsiung, and it's located in Taiwan, and what's the city's characteristics. And then to reverse the direction, this year we are inviting sister cities to join us in an exhibition at our local city government. So every month there is a themed sister city, and we will display the city's introduction, souvenirs, and their specialties, so that our citizens here in Kaohsiung, they can also have a chance to learn about what sister cities we have and what's their characteristics. So this is a small way we're trying to promote this so-called awareness of sister cities under the challenge of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think that the concept of the portable, foldable exhibition, I think that's very interesting because it really helps with visibility and raising awareness, I think. Yeah. Anyone would like to comment on further, or
Well,
I think slowly.
I can say one thing. The effectiveness of raising awareness of Taiwan, the effectiveness of sister city relationships in achieving any of their sort of soft diplomacy goals, right? That's always a challenge. How do you establish what those measures are to say if a relationship is effective and worth engaging in or pursuing, or which ones might not want to spend as much time on. But this also goes back to this people to people versus city to city question, right? Our sister city associations really work on, particularly the Kaohsiung Association, right? They take that dragon boat racing team over, and they were going pretty frequently, not every year, but they had a good exchange going back and forth. And so you certainly had those people-to-people relationships growing, which I think is amazing and fantastic. And I would like to go on one of those trips as well. But then now, as you start to talk about how can city governments work together and identify priority areas where they might be able to learn from each other. If we have in our international strategy, we say if we have lessons to share, we have a responsibility to share them. And if we have areas where we need to learn something from our international partners, then we can go out to our sister cities and other global cities and learn from them. But in those cases, then you're not focused. Then you're not focused on raising awareness of the culture like you are at this people-to-people level. There, you're trying to solve a city issue, whether it's climate change or smart cities, or any kind of topic that you might work on at a city level. And we've had people from Kaohsiung come and visit and meet with our Office of the Waterfront, and they learned about our waterfront construction project, for example. And so maybe they take that lesson back to Kaohsiung and implement it in some way. But then the question, it might have been effective as a tool in sharing information between cities, but then the question is, how do ordinary residents learn that some factor in our waterfront projects were a result of some interaction between our city departments, right? It's harder to draw those connections. So effectiveness is a really good question to address.
Yes, Jeff, you also spoke of Kaohsiung's success in managing the pandemic. And you said, I think, that there's a lot that the world can learn from those experiences. And so if we look at that in the context of city diplomacy and getting more visibility for Taiwan in the world and more support and more interest, how do you see Kaohsiung playing a role?
Yes, I think the lesson from Kaohsiung, I think also from elsewhere in Taiwan is that issues such as density can be managed in the context of the pandemic. I think after the outbreak of COVID-19 around the world, I think there was a lot of concern about cities having a relatively high density becoming problematic for physical context, for social interaction, for the living, for commerce. And I think the case of Kaohsiung, and one can argue also, Singapore and Hong Kong makes a perfect argument that density could be managed. There are ways to manage public health issues that density would not be a obstacle. And so I think and that's a lesson I think the city around the world can benefit from. And so how can we better promote these kind of experiences? How can we become better engaged in conversation about these issues? And since Taiwan is not a member of WHO, what are the other kind of venues and forums this could be conveyed? And actually, in the past year, there were so many online events like this, where it actually became much easier for folks from Taiwan to be part of an international conversation. So Audrey Tan, for example, has done so many interviews in so many places, and her voice is definitely something that people pay attention to, and that has been a success for Taiwan. But I think at the city level, I think more could be done as well.
Yep, thank you for that. Anyone else would like to comment on that? Or slowly, I'm just being mindful of the time, and I think questions are slowly coming in. So maybe I'll just pick the first one. And it's an open one, so I'm not addressing it to one of you in particular, but the question comes from Liam Gibson from the Asia Pacific Youth Association. And the question is, do you think sister city arrangements better facilitate foreign direct investment in Taiwan cities? Anyone would like to take that question? Or we can come back to it maybe in connection to another question. I mean, clearly, I think it has a very valid point on facilitating AI and connecting different. I think, Evelyn, you said to the common challenges and commonalities between cities. So I think definitely this is a platform that can help, but I'm not sure if anyone has more thoughts on that.
I can say, Stacey, go ahead.
Right here, thinking, I don't know about FDI into Taiwan. I know when we think about sister cities and do they promote FDI here to Seattle, the sister city associations really have in the past traditionally tended to focus on cultural and educational exchanges, and then the business exchanges and trade delegations have more been left to government officials and economic development agencies. And so the sister cities, if they don't have expertise in business on their boards and in their civic associations, then they're not so engaged in those business promotion ties. So that's at least how it is here. Sarah, you started to say something.
Sure. I'll add to that I think sister city agreements really are whatever the pair of cities makes of them. And so there's a huge range of what these arrangements look like, how active they are, and what their focus is. And I think some of it has to do with really who the moving forces are behind a given agreement. In some cases, it's an organization of citizens. Often cities with a large Taiwanese or Taiwanese American community might be particularly active in pushing for an agreement or an individual member of a Taiwanese American community might push for an agreement with their hometown or their parents' hometown. In other cases, I've heard about someone like a city manager, a mayor who wants an agreement because of the potential economic benefits. And so in that case, they may be much more focused on developing ties between businesses in the two places. And so there are some agreements that are trying to actively facilitate investment, in some directions more one way than the others, in some directions really two-way investment, but not all agreements. And I think it depends a lot on what, who is driving them and what their motivations are for wanting that agreement to happen.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, as you said, Sarah, that every single sister city is what the two pairs make of it. So it also raises the question of the responsibility of each side to use it to the mutual benefit. And so in the case of Seattle and Kaohsiung, I'm really glad that we managed to have both of you here in the panel, because I think it's by talking about this to our audience, I think it really does raise awareness of the potential that lies in connecting and in connectivity, and also in identifying common challenges and bringing people together. Because I think, again, because we're talking about Taiwan, the challenge of how much we can do for Taiwan and what the constraints are, I think the awareness of Taiwan is crucial to get more support among our citizens. So again, from a European perspective, I see to what extent just raising awareness of the success stories coming out of Taiwan with the pandemic, balancing transparency and the right to privacy and all of that, I think has been something that people are not really aware of in Europe also. So internationally, I think there's a lot that lies in city diplomacy. But again, as you said, Sarah, is what the two sides bring into it. So with that, I think we have a new question. I think this is for Jeff. So can you please expand on your suggestion of university to university cooperation in city diplomacy?
Yes, sure. So I think universities is we do a lot of things: research, publications, teaching. In all of that, I think, and also increasingly, universities have study abroad programs that are very popular among students. And so, collaboration between different research institutions, how we, through our work as scholars, in studying issues and challenges faced by the city and finding relevant experiences. I mentioned in the case of pandemic, for example, how can we learn from different cities? And those learning and process, knowledge production could be facilitated through research institutions. And also we have, a lot of universities and scholars, we have connections around the world. And so it's not just the relationship between, for example, Seattle and Kaohsiung. It's part of a much larger network. And so by strengthening those relationships between different research institutions, we bring cities like Kaohsiung or any other city into a much larger network of people around the world, research institutions, cities, and professionals. And so it's much more than just the spent bilateral relationship between different cities. So that's one thing. And I mentioned students, and students eventually will become career professionals. Some of them will become successful in businesses, in other capacity. And but so building these relationships early on when they were students. And I have a lot of students who came with me on study abroad program. They develop an interest in a particular culture or just living abroad in general. And actually, quite a few students who ended up staying in Asia becoming process themselves, becoming professional themselves, working in, including Taiwan, Japan. And so by cultivating these kind of relationships, we're building something that can last for much longer. And the impact can be much, way beyond just these kind of individual students. These are the ties that can be elevated into something more. And that starts at the university level. So those are just a couple of examples of the university.
Yep, thank you for that. Anyone wants to add anything on to that question? Or not at this stage, we can just move on to the next question. So we have a question. So civil servants in smaller cities might be more reluctant to embrace sister city cooperation and see benefits of subnational diplomacy. How can we promote subnational cooperation between municipalities that are not major cities? So anyone, Sarah perhaps, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think to go back to something that I mentioned earlier, I think funding is a real issue for many smaller cities. And so, if there's, if these are relationships that someone sees as important and, wants to be more than just a piece of paper, wants them to be a meaningful relationship that actually takes people from one place to visit the other, maintains contact for a series of years, there has to be some funding to support that, I think. And so I think that is one concrete thing that's really important. And, I think on the US side, as I sort of alluded to before, I think sometimes officials can be sort of scared off by things like a letter from a Chinese consulate saying you're not allowed to pursue this relationship with a city in Taiwan or things like that. And so I think cities that have successfully signed relationships with Taiwan and maintained those relationships can be helpful in sharing their experience with other cities that are considering such agreements. And, in particular, I think cities that have effectively pushed back against demands that they include language about, there only being one China and Taiwan being part of China or things like that. It's important for them to sort of share the strategies that they've used to effectively push back against that. Because my sense is that there are quite a lot of people who wind up embroiled in what feels like an international controversy, having very little knowledge of the sort of prior history and the complications of the US-Taiwan PRC relationship.
Yeah, on that note, since you mentioned also the Taipei-Prague relationship and Shanghai no longer being the sister of Prague, I think looking forward, I think it's a good question to ask, to what extent can this sort of cooperation with the political sensitivities, to what extent do you think that this can serve as inspiration to other similar initiatives? Or do you think that that's one thing? I'm just thinking out loud here. And also, I think in itself, it's the question of content. It's not enough just to have this is great, and I think it's very useful and constructive in terms of visibility for Taiwan in Europe. But then I think the challenge will be to really make this very rich in content to actually contribute to long-term to Taiwan's visibility in Europe. So do you think this can set a precedent, or can be more than just in itself a city, the sister city partnership? Sarah, perhaps, or anyone?
Sure.
So in terms of the precedent, are you talking about the precedent of maintaining a relationship with a city in Taiwan, even though that led to their agreement with Shanghai being canceled, or
Yes.
what? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that both localities and many countries are at this sort of moment of reckoning with their relationship with the PRC and thinking about what they want that relationship to look like. And, certainly in the US, I think we're in a moment where across the political spectrum, many people feel like we're at a moment of fundamental change in the US's relationship with the PRC. And so I think we're seeing that in terms of things like universities pushing back against the Confucius Institutes, to go back to Jeff's point about universities as kind of sites of subnational diplomacy. And I think we may see it more in terms of cities being willing to abandon a relationship with a city in mainland China. I think there was a sense that those relationships had the potential for such great economic value that they were really high value relationships. And I think some places are now souring on those relationships. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see more of that, especially because I think, Taiwan has, I think a lot of people have come to view Taiwan very favorably in the last year and a half. Even people who knew nothing about Taiwan 18 months ago, right, have heard about its successes with COVID, and have really come to see Taiwan in a positive and very sympathetic light. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see more cities that are kind of choosing between a relationship or choosing a relationship with a city in Taiwan over a relationship with the PRC if push comes to shove. I should note that there are lots of cities that do have relationships with a city in Taiwan and a city in the PRC, right? So historically, cities have not been forced to make that choice. So whether they will be forced to kind of make that choice in the future as a result of more kind of hardline PRC diplomacy is also, I think, an important question.
Yeah, actually, Prague is an interesting example. I mean, it's somewhat unique because the mayor has a personal connection to Taiwan. So if this were any other city, I don't think it would be able to have the kind of relationship that it will be able to withstand pressure from China. And but it also demonstrate one important thing I mentioned before is these kind of interpersonal ties. So the Prague mayor was actually an exchange student in Taiwan, and that's how he learned about Taiwan and had developed personal ties. And so if we can have more of these kind of interpersonal ties, these kind of exchanges, at the level beyond just official ties between different cities, I think these are what really can sustain and strengthens the relationship between civil organizations, people from different cities.
Yes, Evelyn.
If I may add on to that and also respond to what you earlier said about the visibility of Taiwan in Europe, I want to share a small example we had. Last year, we have donated 300,000 medical masks to Bratislava region in the Slovak Republic. And then this year in May, the pandemic situation in Taiwan had become difficult. And right at that moment, we received a tweet from the president of that region. He tweeted that he was very worried about Taiwan and he was praying for us. And then he even recorded a message saying that he supports Taiwan and he also supports Taiwan's participation in the World Health Organization. And then later on this year in July, when we learned that the Slovak Republic pledged to donate 10,000 vaccines to Taiwan, we were very thrilled because we feel like at that time donating masks is just something we felt that we could do, but we didn't expect that there would be so much positive feedback following up, and it's like we have joined forces with some greater good. And also a lot of other countries are doing actual things to help Taiwan too when we are in need of vaccines. For example, the US and Japan and Lithuania. So at the local government level, we are also really looking forward to explore relationships with cities in these countries.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. Also, to recognize that a lot more people know and are interested in Taiwan than 2-3 years ago, and that's great. But the question is, how can Taiwan keep that momentum? And that's something that the government needs to work on, but every single citizen and individual. So it's on several layers. And I think, as you said, Sarah, I think that's important, but also it's important to recognize that cities can play a bigger role in the future. So to capitalize on this momentum. So,
well, this may tie back to your earlier comment about wondering how you can get smaller cities to engage in the kind of subnational diplomacy, right, that would promote Taiwan. Zoom has made this possible, so many things possible that weren't before. Here in Seattle, we get, pre-COVID, we get a lot of requests from cities around the world who want to come and talk to various city departments about, they want to learn about our green buildings or various elements of the city government. Now you may be able to make those connections, either build on the momentum that Taiwan has coming out of COVID, and or build on connections with smaller cities, as you mentioned earlier, by having those kinds of visits. Visits happen virtually rather than in person, and where in-person travel and having to learn about a country and learn about the city department and have a really high barrier for that international interaction in the past, now that barrier is much lower, right? And so I had many delegations come to Seattle before. I imagine we're going to get a lot more requests now, because you might get smaller cities that want to come and engage, or might want to engage without coming to visit, because we can do that more readily now.
Yep, that's a good point. I think I'm also mindful of the time, because I see we have 5 minutes left. And so what I thought, I would just say maybe just a minute or two for each one of you. So I don't know if we have more time for questions, but what I thought to wrap up the exchange with was just to give you a minute to share with the audience, like, your most, say, in your view, the most relevant and important point that you would highlight when it comes to city diplomacy as a tool to circumvent Taiwan's isolation, diplomatic isolation. And do you see this for the future as an effective tool? So that would be the question. And so I think since we have 4 minutes, maybe we just do that now. Maybe we go in the same or in the reverse order. So would you mind, Sarah, taking that question first? You could just...
Sorry about that. Ultimately, I think it's important for Taiwan to build a global coalition, not just of leaders that care about Taiwan, but citizens, especially in democracies that care about Taiwan. And, ultimately, if Taiwan needs help from the US in coming to its defense, that's an easier case to make if American citizens want the US government to come to Taiwan's defense. And so I think that in some ways, city level diplomacy feels very, very far from those kinds of big geopolitical questions. But I do think it's really important for Taiwan to try to make those local level connections and to try to, have as many people as possible kind of with direct experience of, direct knowledge of either going to Taiwan, meeting people from Taiwan, learning about Taiwan. Because if citizens don't know about it or don't care, then it's hard for me to imagine their elected officials caring very much either.
Thank you. Excellent point. Jeff, your turn.
Sure.
Same question.
Okay. Well, I think, cities and communities are becoming so much more interconnected around the world these days. So people are naturally and intuitively interested in what's going on and what they can learn from other experience from other places. And so I think it's important to recognize that, oftentimes we sort of underplay our importance. Things that are interesting in Taiwan are businesses, cultural activities, and so forth. But the people that I know actually find those quite interesting. And so, for example, we have a Seattle Taiwanese film festival. And so each year, films in Taiwan are played in Seattle, and we get quite a good-sized audience, and the audience is actually expanding. And so things that may be undervalued before actually have a lot of appeal to the audience outside. But I think we need to find out, so what are the common connections? What makes people interested? And so that they're naturally kind of drawn to developing these types.
Thank you for that. Evelyn?
I think that there is a lot the city can do to help contribute to expanding Taiwan's international space. And from the local government level, for the sister cities exchanges in the future, I think we will try more to incorporate not just the official level, but also more people to people, for example, the awareness raising to let more people learn about Taiwan, starting maybe from Kaohsiung, and then to develop some actual programs and some exchange projects. I think little by little, the city can contribute to expanding Taiwan's international stand.
Thank you. And Stacy?
Someone from the State Department once told me that they really valued the people-to-people relationships that were fostered by sister city programs because they were the foundation for building up higher levels of diplomacy. So the people-to-people relationships help us then at the city level to build city-to-city relationships, and so on up to higher levels of government. And so, yeah, to continue working on finding ways that we can interact either city to city or finding topic areas that we are trying to address with our individual city partners, and then also with multilateral international organizations where multiple cities are coming together to work on something. I think being part of that and working together on those things will help raise the profile of Taiwan.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that was a really strong message and point to sort of highlight the main ideas that we shared in this webinar, that city people is the foundation to building up high diplomacy. I think that's a very positive note to wrap up our exchange when it comes to Taiwan and Taiwan's future internationally through city diplomacy as an effective tool. I think we agree on that, but there's challenges as with everything. So I think there's a constructive way to go forward, and I'm very glad that you all joined us today, and I'm very glad and that I had the honor to moderate the discussion. I hope that we got as much as we could in the 1 hour. It's not a long time, but I would like to again say thank you for your participation and your contributions, and to everyone's contributions and questions, and also to the team helping us put this together at 9-9 and NextGen Taiwan. So with that big thank you note, I would like to wrap up today's meeting, and I invite all of you to join us to the third webinar we will have in September on tech and transparency in Taiwan. There will be details coming soon, so stay with us, and I wish you all a good rest of the day or evening wherever you are. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.